You are all incredibly welcome. I am delighted to have so many people here. There's currently 24 people in our group, but a few more I think joining as the minutes roll on. We were very disappointed that we don't have Doug in person in Ireland this week, as we had a number of different things that he was going to do with us. But he's very generously agreed to come back and to reschedule that in-person visit later this year, maybe in the autumn. So you can look out for invites to some in-person stuff in the autumn. But for today's talk, so it's the rescheduled of the in-person talk Doug was going to give on campus in Mary I in Limerick. As part of the LSRE Lecture Series. This is the final talk in the LSRE Lecture Series this semester, and it is on the Pedagogy of Hope for Global Social Justice. So I'm going to read out Doug's bio so that I don't forget any of it. Professor Douglas Bourn is the Professor of Development Education, and he's the Director of Development Education Research Centre at the Institute of Education within the Faculty of Education and Society at University College London. Prior to establishing the Development Education Research Centre, Doug was Director of the Development Education Association. He is also co-chair of the Academic Network for Global Education Researchers, which many of you will know as ANGEL, and we are so delighted and so lucky to have you here with us, Doug. Our session today, we are due to finish up at 3 o'clock, so we just have the hour, and Doug is going to talk to us for a little while, and then we'll have a short chance for Q&A as well. So if you have thoughts or questions throughout, please post them in the chat as we go. So I'm going to hand over to you, Doug, if you want to share your screen. Thank you.
Okay, can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's showing up. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Breed. Yeah, I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you in person today. I'm just recovering from illness, but I'm hoping I can come again in the autumn. And because I've got a long-standing relationship with many of you based in Ireland and also obviously beyond Ireland for work in this field of global citizenship education and historically within development education. So to me, I look to Ireland as one of the key places for promoting discussions around themes of global citizenship, global education and development education. So I'm really pleased that I can at least give a talk to you today. In part, it's going to be based around the edited book that I published last year with my colleague Massimiliano Turozzi, but it's also putting that in a bit more of a sort of current educational and social context. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start by talking about some of the questions about anxiety and concerns that particularly young people have today, and the impact of the various global crises that are going on. Then to say a little bit about why I think the ideas of Paulo Freire and his book Pedagogy of Hope is particularly relevant, important in this context. And then what I plan to do is to link that discussion about hope to what I call a distinctive pedagogical approach that to me needs to be linked to questions of global social justice. And then I end by talking about where I see that linking to discussions around global citizenship education. And hopefully be able to talk for about 25-30 minutes. Okay, so that's what my plan. I want to start by reminding ourselves of the current sort of social and political context within which we're all living and working. And I've been involved in this field for way too long, but I can remember 25 years ago really finding it quite challenging to get talking to teachers and educators and even young people about the importance of learning about the wider world and global issues. I don't think we have a problem nowadays. I think the sense in which the impact of what's happening in the world, the impact of climate change, the increasing impact of the wars in Europe, and a whole number of global issues and events have meant that people are much more conscious of what's happening in the world, as well, of course, people having instant access to forms of communication knowledge, the role that social media has played. But there's been quite a lot of literature recently that's talked about how young people particularly feel very concerned about the future. And this is, two quotes from young people from some research that was done that summarizes some of that concern. And I think we need to understand that, as educators, why there is that concern, and what do we see our role as educators to be to addressing that. And to me, that you've got to understand why a lot of children and young people have a concern about the future of the planet, about their own status, about what's happening in the world, and that we need to engage with that to understand it and work with them to work through a process of how we can consider a better future for us all and for generations to come. And there's been, as I said, a range of research, and I think that what is interesting is that this concern about climate change particularly, but it goes beyond climate change, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, it goes across I think all countries around the world, whether high-income countries, middle-income countries, or low-income countries, because in a sense, what the climate change is having impact all throughout the world. And I think what's also happened is not only the sense of being concerned, is the sense of young people particularly feeling ignored, powerless, and anxious. And the sense and what that means in terms of how people then respond to that, because I'm not quite sure how to address it. I gave a sort of similar talk to this to some students at a university in London about 2 months ago. And one of the questions I got was, well, for some students, do you think we should have children? There was that sense about the future. And my response to that was, I think it's the wrong question to ask. You've got to flip it over and look about actually why you have saying those sorts of questions and what they mean. But there is a sense, I think, about anxiety and distress that I think we need to recognize. Now, of course, this anxiety was heightened during the global pandemic, and which probably brought some of these things to the fore. But I think we need to recognize that. And I think that some research in the UK showed that there was increasing concern from young people in the UK and elsewhere in the world about wanting to respond to these issues. Now, and we know from the activities around climate change from Greta Thunberg and others, the sense in which many thousands of young people have become actively engaged in the big crises of today. And whilst a lot of that form of engagement has been around social media, it has also been quite interesting that a lot of it has also been around raising awareness and educating their peers. And I found it really interesting that a lot of that activity by young people has been of an educative nature. And when I saw this said that 50% of young people engaged in some form of social action in the UK, I thought, is that really true? But if you break that down to actually that form of social action could just be clicking a button or signing something, that there can be quite simplistic forms of engagement, which you can almost take too literally. But to me, it says something about the level of concern there are amongst young people. But also I think that there's also a sense, I think, that poses questions about how young people feel about the future and their sense of who they are and their sense of place in the world. And I think that, to me, that is something we need to recognize, that it's not just about anxiety about climate change. I think it's something more broadly than that. And I think that what's been happening around the wars in the Middle East and the impact of the war in Ukraine has reinforced that. But a lot of this response by educationalists and by policymakers has been used to this term eco-anxiety as a way of responding to that. It's not a term I particularly like. But what I've found that actually, if you look at some of the literature, it's been quite sort of psychological focused and very individualistic focused. And I'm much more interested in how you address these questions and concerns amongst groupings of young people or groupings of people generally in society. It's not a specific individualistic response that's about behavior change. It's much broader than that, and I think more educational. So to me, it's about how we translate this sense of anxiety into more positive forms of engagement. And when I was involved in a seminar on this at my own university a year ago, one of my colleagues said, well, it's not about anxiety, it's about anger. And I think that's something to think about, because the sense that it's about wanting to do something rather than just feeling powerless and negative. And that to me is where, from our field around global citizenship, I think particularly we've got an important role to play. So we're aware of the many forms of young people's responses around climate justice, and also more recently against about the war in the Middle East and so on. There's a sense that young people are taking action and are raising concerns about these issues. But there's an important question about what's the basis of that engagement and what is it grounded in, and to what extent is it based on some level of understanding and development of skills to know how to take positive action for social change. And that's where I think we have an important role to play in this our field of global citizenship education, that as educators we have an important role to play in terms of helping to understand this concern amongst children and young people, but also what we can see, what should be our forms of intervention and forms of engagement. And to me, one of the dangers that in the age of social media, and the immediate access to knowledge, often there's a danger that young people particularly just take what's the latest bit of information they've got without actually looking at things critically, looking at a range of bodies of evidence and information. So to me, the development of skills of critical thinking to identify what's most relevant and appropriate and based in some real evidence, to me becomes important, which is where I think we come in. And it's not about saying just supporting young people to campaign, it's about actually providing that educational response. And I do have some concerns that some NGOs around Europe and beyond have really got onto the bandwagon of around climate change and getting young people to be active and campaigners without actually putting the, I would say, the groundwork in to make sure that there's a level of understanding, support for these issues, and it's grounded some deep body of understanding. And I think that's also an area that we need to be concerned about. And we know from lots of campaigns over the last 10, 15 years or so, there has been what often has been called this term collectivism, that actually that young people just respond by pressing a button and that's fine, that's it, they've then done their bit. And I think we need to think about where we see our role in relation to that, that we are not somehow just squeezed out of that, that we are the sort of the meat in the sandwich, where there should be the heart of what those issues and questions are. So that's why I think the whole response to that has to be framed within the whole area of global citizenship education, global education, and education for sustainable development. Because to me, that provides the framework, the educational framework, in which to address these issues. This is the declaration from the Global Education Network Europe that was agreed in Dublin 2 years ago, and I'm sure quite a number of you were there. And I think what is interesting about this declaration is the way in which it uses phrases like enables people to critically, reflect critically on the world and their place in it, open their eyes, hearts and minds to the reality of the world. And I'll say a bit more about reality in a bit more. But also it's about empowers people to understand, imagine and hope, which is something obviously I should be talking more about in a moment, and act to bring about a world of social change. So there's a sense in which there's a process of learning, okay, that's about understanding, that's about engagement, that's about people taking some sense of responsibility. But it's also about making connections between the range of issues and themes that are dominant in the world today. So to me, you talk about climate justice, you've got to also talk about peace. You've also got to talk about solidarity, inequity, and human rights, for example. and also anti-racist work. And I think all those things are interlinked in a way. And one of our roles as educators, I think, is to draw out what those links and connections are. And it's not about this week we do climate change, next week we do human rights, the week after that we do gender. And I think it's about how we present what I talk about as a pedagogical response to these challenges, of which we put global citizenship education at the heart. And the person I look to inspire me to think about these things is the Brazilian educationist Paulo Freire. Now, I had the good fortune a very long time ago when I was doing some of my research to meet Paulo Freire at the university I was at Kiel in England. And I remember just meeting him briefly and listening to what he had to say. And I thought, I've got to think about how I can include some of his thinking about education and social change in my future work. And somehow it took me off in a slightly different direction. But I have never forgotten some of the things he said about that you've got to challenge the dominant neoliberalist mode of education, that all education is political, it all raises ideological questions. And we need to teach how to read, become as meaningful. It involves teaching about how to read the world. It's about understanding that world. And that poses a liberatory approach that this way talks about consciousization, this critical consciousness, and the sense in which there's a connection between what education, the role of education and societal change, but also it's about an approach to education that's about opening the learners' minds to think about the world in many different ways and different perspectives. And Freire, in his book Pedagogy of Hope, talks about how we take these things forward. And I think he talks about we need a critical hope in the way that a fish needs unpolluted water. We need positive ways to move forward. And I think he also talks about the dangers of succumbing to fatalism, the sense about needing to think about moving forward, and that it's talking about being hopeful. And to me, I found that is really interesting. And I've sort of said to a lot of people when I've been talking about this area, to be a good educationalist, you have to be an optimistic educationalist. You have to be promoting a sense of optimism and hope in all your teaching and learning, because if you don't, you're not being a good educator. And to me, that took me back to the ideas and work of Paulo Freire, and which I still find really relevant. One of his disciples, the American academic Henry Giroux, has taken that forward, and he talks about his work on critical pedagogy. He makes connections between the need of a new vision of hope that challenges the dominant neoliberal forces in society. And he comes up with this term, educated hope, that sense that it's not just about some idealistic vision of the future. It's got to be grounded in some deepening of understanding and learning about issues. It's got to understand the different contexts that people learn and engage with. So when we talk, going back to what I was saying earlier about young people having a sense of anxiety and a sense of concern about the future, an educated hope means to understand that, to understand their sense of hopelessness, and also to work with those groups of young people to address them and able to move forward. And it also means, as he suggests, going beyond some emotional response to the future and to recognize that these things are not easy, and that there's no one future scenario in terms of moving forward. I'm still at relatively early stages in my thinking about what is meant by educated hope. And one of the things I want to do in the future is to think about what does this mean in reality. If you're getting some sort of proactive research with the groups of teachers and young people, what would that mean and what would that look like? And I think that will be a really interesting thing. And I'd be interested to know for any of you about how you've started to engage in some of these issues in terms of moving forward. So when I've looked at this literature around the sense of hope and moving forward, is this sense of what Kelly talks about as an exercise in hope. It's it needs to be thought through in a radical way, not just a way of providing some sort of vision, but as a way of understanding what's happening in the world today, because you can't create a sense of hope and positive change without understanding and engaging with the issues that concern us today. And then you work with that as a way of providing some sense of moving forward. And I think that, to me, is I found really important in terms of going forward. So what I've done in some of the stuff that I've been writing about is to try and pose a pedagogy of hope that builds on the work of Freire, that connects it to a sense of justice and sustainable futures, but also looks at how we move forward in a distinctive educational way. So I talk about locating challenges in real world experiences, the need to go beyond quick fix solutions and to recognize that issues today are complex, and to understand the relationship between hope and hopelessness, and that actually how we understand that and work with that, and promoting sense that change is possible to give future scenarios, and engaging in a active process that seeks change to a more just and sustainable future. And that's how I try and sort of summarize my thinking on that. And one of the people that has been influential in my thinking about this has been the English educationist David Hicks, who was quite a well-known figure in the 80s and 90s, particularly in England, around global education. He then, in more later years, became very interested in futures education, which, to be honest, until I started to think about this area 3 or 4 years ago, I hadn't really engaged in that literature. And it's worth looking at literature around futures education. And he wrote this publication looking at climate change education, in 2018, that was very much influenced by some of this futures thinking, but also, I would suggest, also framed within the context of what historically been global education and global citizenship. And I find this approach very interesting. So he talks about starting with sharing how young people can share their feelings about climate change issues without feeling they'll be criticised or laughed at, creating a safe space. Secondly, to promote a culture where people listen to others and to be feel that they're listened to, feel engaged. To recognise there's the need to be some depth of understanding, and that requires some informed development of knowledge, and also how that then leads to forms of action, social action, what can be done within a school environment, what can be done within a home or the community. And the sense, and I think that seeing this whole approach about hope in the future as a pedagogical approach, and not as something you just do, all right, we're going to do, you can't reduce it to a lesson. It is much more about seeing about how we teach and how we approach our teaching and learning. How do we ensure that these themes and this staged approach is reflected in what we teach and what we do? So when we started to bring all this stuff together with my colleague Massimiliano Tarozzi, we started to think of that when we started to put hope and pedagogy of hope. It also poses questions that links to challenging dominant ways in which education is thought and the change within society. And therefore, it needs to be linked to a sense of what he talks about, critical hope, to this sense of global social justice, because the hope has got to lead to something. It's got to be linked to some sense of what sort of world we wanted to see. And to me, a more social justice-based society is one that we should all be working towards. So this is how there's been a wealth of literature around global social justice, and to me, I find this quite interesting because there's this approach which starts from challenges, the inequalities that exist, that promoting a sense of human rights, bringing in a sense of equity and fairness that leads to some form of social activism. But also it means at the end there's a deepening of understanding of our role and the nature of the world in which we live. So there are various ways in which you can configure this, and obviously these things are never in a linear process. But to me, there's a sense about a process of learning that I think should be the heart of what we're all talking about. So when I started to bring these things together, what I started to say was this, that in terms of moving forward, global citizenship education needs to start to think about the following. It needs to put more emphasis on promoting positive alternatives to the future of societies, showing that change is possible, and that there needs to be
I don't know Hindi.
Emphasis on what's going forward. All right, there needs to be move beyond some sense of idealistic dream, that which is often the case with hope, that needs to be located in understanding the real world. And that therefore, to me, this needs to be posed within what I talk about as a pedagogy of hope, and that therefore poses these things and linking between what has been the traditions of development education and global citizenship to the wider purposes of education. And you put hope and social justice, I would suggest, a way of bringing those things together. So in terms of coming to my conclusion, a lot of these things are posed in this book that we have published last year, which came out of an earlier Angel conference. And it's an edited volume that has these themes of conceptualizing hope and global social justice and applying global social justice, and the whole range of educators from around the world. And what's also really exciting about this publication is that it's available as an open access book, and that's one of the things we agreed with our publishers, Bloomsbury. So wherever you're based around the world, or you can freely download this book. It's an edited book, and we're now looking at producing, working on a follow-up volume based on the themes from the recent Angel conference. So to me, one of the things I think is important about these conversations and discussions is that to get them out there and get them engaged, the range of people, you need to ensure that a lot of the issues you're talking about are accessible, are available to educators and policymakers, and that actually it starts a conversation about how you then move these things forward. And I suppose finally, a lot of this work built on this publication I did a few years ago called Education for Social Change. And what brought me to that was that I was finding there's a lot of activity within our whole field around development education, global citizenship education, that talk liberally around education for social change, but what did it actually mean? And so to me, what I found by looking at how that evolved and what that looked like led to me this concept of a pedagogy for global social justice. And now, to me, what I've now taken forward in the latest work that I've just been talking about is you need to think through recognizing that we are in challenging times politically and socially because of what's happening in the world and the fears about the future of the world. And therefore, we need to give increased emphasis, I would suggest, to these concepts of hope and change that enable us to move forward to a better world. So in conclusion, a pedagogy of hope, therefore, to me, has to be linked to a sense of social change, and that education clearly has an important central role to play within this. This pedagogy approach needs to be framed within a learner-centered approach that encourages critical thinking, a dialogic approach, and has a values-based root in social justice. It is not just something about increased knowledge or of increased skills. It's much broader than that. What is evident is that from a range of international policy initiatives, whether it's from UNESCO, the UN, or in Europe through Global Education Network Europe, and even the European Commission, there's increased engagement in some of these issues and debates. There's increasing reference to these themes in some of the debates, but it's still at the level, I would suggest, too much of generality and not enough about what does this look like in practice and how do we bring these things in to helping our teachers and teacher educators bring this more centrally to their work. And I think, therefore, to me, we need to make sure we develop ways to operationalize these themes, because the issues that are currently facing the world, I'm afraid, not going to go away. I think the role and impact of climate change is going to increase. I fear we're going to move to a more destabilized world with increased conflicts around the world. And this sense, but at the same time, there's still the increased divisions between the rich and the poor. So to me, we therefore have a role, I would say, a major responsibility as educators to put into practice this pedagogy of hope as a way of starting to show the everyday relevance of our work to some of the big global challenges of today. Thank you very much.
Doug, thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic talk. I've been desperately writing down and scribbling notes, trying to follow what you're saying. I'd like to invite people who are joined with us here online. If anybody has questions or comments for Doug, you're welcome to share them either in the chat, or please feel free to be brave and turn on your camera and microphone as well, if there's anything you'd like to bring specifically to Doug at this stage.
Yes, could I just ask?
Go ahead, Jack.
Yes, thank you. It's just one question, Doug, and it's linked to this tension that I've always got between an individual taking the responsibility that you're talking about and then moving it to collective action for which we have a kind of communal responsibility for living the values that you're talking about. And I just wondered if you could say just a little bit about that.
Yes, and I suppose it alludes to what I was saying earlier, because a lot of the research and literature around this area at the moment has been very sort of, I would say, psychological, individualistic based, and hasn't actually looked at the ways in which you address some of these challenges is through some form of collective engagement and collective responsibility, right? And I think, as we know, we get some of the best forms of feeling good about ourselves the more that we do by working with others to secure change rather than doing things on our own. And I think one of the problems is that I say that almost that social media has almost led us down this very individualistic route in many ways, because something was easy to do. And I think one of the things that we haven't been very good at is actually identifying groups of activities or coming up with projects that show what can be done as a group to demonstrate what you can do collectively. Because to me, it's not individual action that's going to secure change; it's collective action. And I think that's a challenge at the moment. And I haven't got an answer to that, but I think the problem is that because so much of our ways in which we looked at responses in recent years has been from a very individualistic way, or if it becomes collective ways, it's seen as just going on a demonstration or something. It's not. I think we're losing a bit of imagination about what we should be doing, really.
No, thanks for that. It's just that I put in the chat the flyer for the 4th International Conference. I think it's next October, which I think is helping to take the ideas forward that you've just been talking about. So it's just in the chat. Yeah. Well, many thanks for that. And in particular, for your open access book, I've just downloaded it. So I look forward to that. So thank you for that.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Jack. Is there anybody else who'd like to raise a question or pose a comment? Trasa, I see you have your hand up there.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Doug. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Really, lots of really interesting things to talk about there. I just wanted to get your advice or to ask. So a lot of like you have a lot of the work around global citizenship work is kind of placed within the critical pedagogy framework. And it does seem to be, you know, with Ferrer's work and Giroux, and it does seem to be the one that's best aligned with the values expressed by global citizenship. But in its kind of efforts to explore different power relations and to you know, to kind of assist the students to see their place in wider structures of power and oppression. Often you can find with the students that it triggers that kind of cognitive dissonance about their responsibilities, and rather this has the opposite effect of driving them away from in impeding action and driving them away from action. And so I was wondering, I've been thinking a bit about not to move away from the critical pedagogy framework, but how to add to it in such a way that is going to kind of address that issue a little bit. And I've been looking more at kind of ethics of care and its influence on emotional context. And when you bring in that kind of a framework added to it, it can, I'm wondering if you think that there's potential to somehow address this issue of the cognitive dissonance that comes along with seeing your role and your contributions, that is weighs very heavily on them in the context of critical pedagogy. That was my question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you an easy answer to that, because I don't think there is one, but I think the sense in which the role of the emotional context is, I think, an important one, although a bit of word warning that sometimes emotional things can stay at that and not be built upon, you know. And but I think there is, I think we've got a long way to go yet, and looking about what these things actually mean in terms of processes of learning and different ways people, particularly young people, respond to these issues and how they engage. And there has been, you know, I think only now starting to re-engage in some what I would call meaningful research, really. And but what I would say is that there is a challenge for us, that in the sense that a lot of these issues can often be left for young people particularly to try and resolve themselves. And I think what, to me, one of the big questions is, what is our role as educators in this process of learning? And when you talk about a sense of cognitive dissonance and the sense in which young people not feeling know how to engage in what they do, then I think we need to look much more about how we can ensure that our educators, our teachers and our teacher educators are equipped to inform learners about how to engage in these issues, because these things are not easy, right? And I just know recently, because of all the conversations there have been in our country, and I suspect in yours, around the whole impact of the war in the Middle East, and in the sense in which schools are saying, you know, we're not going to discuss that, you know, it's too complex and too difficult. And to me, that we're not been very good about how we see our role as educators in terms of how we relate what we're teaching to what's happening in the world today. I don't think we've been very good about training teachers to know how to respond to that, and also to recognize that how young people learn today is very different to what it was 10, 15 years ago. And therefore, the processes of learning and how they respond needs to be understood. And I've had some of my students been trying to look at the role of social media and those things about how young people learn about global issues. And they're looking for literature and found very little, right? And I think we have a responsibility ourselves to try and engage more directly in these questions and debates.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doug. So much food for thought there. Marie, I see you have your hand up there. Do you want to come in? Oh, you're currently muted, Marie. One sec, I'll unmute you.
The sense of the wind, I get a feeling that we might be in very similar social contexts. But if we're talking about how we educate for the world, there are many contexts where what is understood as social justice is not what I would understand by social justice. I would understand by the values of human flourishing are not those that are extant within that society. And what I have an idea of how we can work with hope, with those with whom, if you like, I agree, I'm on the same planet, but I need to find a way of working with those who are not necessarily on the same planet, because otherwise, aren't I just doing what it is that I complain of imposing on others? Besides which, you can't impose on others, it just ends up with literally a war, as you can see in a lot of places around the world. So, have you got any thoughts on those?
Is that what you're saying, that how to engage with those that are not engaging or not don't see a sense of positivity, or what are you thinking about in that context?
What is a sense of positivity in one context is not the same as a positivity in another.
Yes,
the mores of, for instance, the jihadists are not mine.
Yeah.
They're part of my world.
And I think my response to that is, I think too often in our field of global citizenship and historically and developed education has been around, here's this product, we want you to sign up to it and understand it and agree with it. And what we haven't done enough is to start from understanding where young people are at, what the issues of concern they have and what their views are, and starting that process as a much more dialogic way, and understanding and working with, and goes back to that sort of framework that I showed, because to me that's still a challenge. And so, for example, in some of the literature I've seen around climate change education, it has been this sense, well, you've got to be doing this because it's good for you and good for the future of the planet, without actually understanding why young people might have particular views or may not feel it's relevant to them, right? And I don't think we've yet got the ways in which develop the approaches that really start to address those questions. And I think that, to me, is where we've got to do a lot more research and finding out, because I think that there is a danger that, and it's happening, I think, a lot. It's happening increasingly with climate change at the moment. It's almost become the right-on thing that everyone's got to be doing, without actually putting that in a broader context and seeing it as much broader questions than that, not just about the future of the planet, but also about understanding how young people respond to these issues in different ways. And I've just found that at my own university, we've now got a centre on climate change and sustainability education, and their problem is they've been drawn into a more narrower and narrower approach to where they could get funding for, and not actually recognising these are about questions of social and environmental justice, is about sustainability. And I think that, to me, is where we've got to do a lot more thinking and discussion around these sorts of questions, what they all mean. And it also may mean that those of us who have been involved in this field for some time need to start to have conversations with other sectors in education who perhaps have not talked to enough.
Thanks, Doug. Are there any other questions or comments from people online with us that you'd like to add? Eilish, off you go.
Sorry, I was trying to get in there earlier on. I was on the wrong system. Thanks a million, Doug. That was fantastic, really interesting. And at a very strong instinctual level, I think a pedagogy of hope is so important, apart from the the necessity of being able to engage meaningfully with people with the utterly devastating challenges that we face in our world today. And a lot of the points that you've made, I think, are really important about being optimistic, finding alternatives, looking kind of creating imaginative ways of dealing with the complex challenges that we faced. So I really like to thank you for all that. My question is about how does all of this and your work around all of this sit with the kind of, I suppose, the strong critique of global citizenship education that's coming from Vanessa Andreotti and the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures collective, which, while I think acknowledging kind of a balanced type of hope, also raises questions about it being, well, this is how I would see it, that there's also an importance in, or it's also important to place emphasis on a pedagogy of honesty, or of obviously of decoloniality, but not, it's really kind of questioning any false kind of optimism. And I'm not putting what you've said as an opposition to that point, by the way, but I just wonder, how do you deal with those kinds of points that are coming up from Vanessa and the work of the collective, who are placing emphasis, it would seem to me, on trying to grapple with the challenges, even more so than and challenging this kind of false or overly optimistic kind of hope perspective. I don't know if that makes sense, or if it's even a fair question, but
yeah, it does make sense. I don't see it as a contradiction at all. And I can remember an early conversation I had with Vanessa about this a few years ago, and she raised that with me, and my response, well, I see the work they've been doing and all discussion on decoloniality is very key and central to all the discussions on global citizenship education, and it's very important that the whole approach is recognised and valued and put into the mix in terms of all the perspectives there are. What I feel is potentially a danger, and I've found this from experience of some of my students and people I've worked with, is that it almost reinforces a sense of hopelessness, right? And that and also can reinforce a sense, particularly for people living in countries that have had a very strong colonial heritage, a sense of guilt, right? And to me, it's important that you work through that and come out the other side as a way of moving forward. And that's one of the reasons, to be honest, I've started to work in this area, because some of my earlier discussions, because a lot of my students on the master's program that I've been teaching on for a long time, a lot of the students used some of Vanessa Andreotti's work, her Through Other Eyes stuff, and they thought it was the best thing since sliced bread and thought it was great, right? So my response was, yes, it's very good, but actually, so what do you do with it, right? And how do you move forward as an educator, right? It's easy to critique your role and what's happening in the world, but you've got to move beyond that. Otherwise, it can reinforce a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness. So therefore, and I think Vanessa will probably agree with it, there's a danger that people will almost pile in a heap on the floor. They're like put into bits, right? And we've got a responsibility to build that up again in a positive and constructive way. So to me, I'm not saying it's the sort of the magic bullet, the magic answer, but I think there are dangers of taking a decolonial approach that just stays there, right? And I suspect for many of us on this call, we're engaged in this world because we want to see a better world, right? We want a more just and sustainable world. We want one that engages more people and sees a more better society. You don't do that by just critiquing. You do that by also engaging with people and engaging with the communities to secure social change. And to me, that is where there's the challenge about where we see our work in relation to that. Because I think my view is that I recognise and value that contribution, but to be honest, I've moved beyond that now, because I feel as though because of the current crisis in which we're living and working in, we need to be bringing things that are much more sense of what we can do to be more optimistic and more future orientated. Because as I said, if you're not an optimistic educator, you're not a good educator. And there are dangers if that approach just stays there. It can do the opposite of that. I don't think that's their intention. I don't think they want, but it can be in the wrong hands and just been left there unless you have the good educators who can then move forward from that.
Brilliant. Thanks a million. Yeah.
Doug, thank you so much. We probably have time for one more question or comment. If there's anyone that has a burning question that they want to fit in before the end. Dorothy. There's 3 hands up, so I'm going to go with Dorothy. For Monica and Teresa, if you want to put your questions into the chat, and we'll see how time is going, where we manage to respond to them. But Dorothy was in first. Dorothy, you're currently muted. If you want to unmute yourself. Okay, unfortunately, we can't hear Dorothy, which means, Monica, you're very lucky you jumped to the top of the queue if you want to jump in and ask Doug.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Doug, for this wonderful opportunity to see you online, but nonetheless see you and hear you. And also thank you, Breed, for extending this invitation to everyone from the SIG and abroad. So the world is here to watch Doug. That's great. That's wonderful. My question, so I've been involved for some time now in service and pre-service teacher education related to global citizenship education. And when my student teachers bring these issues into the classroom, I always leave the classroom with a sense of students being in sense of despair and hopelessness. And my students just come back and tell me, well, wasn't I supposed to be teaching these issues to them, these global issues that they are all very interested? And they always tell me that they find it very difficult to have this balance between this sense of urgency in these issues and sense of hope in instilling students and telling them that it is possible for them to make a change. So how can I better teach my in-service teachers and pre-service teachers and tell them, okay, it's possible for you to make that balance and don't bring these issues in the sense that is hopeless, and it's because it's very gloomy. We leave the room with a sense of students being in a total sense of anxiety and despair. So thank you.
I think my response to that is to say that we have a responsibility of educators to, when we're raising these issues, to bring in the stories of change, of positivity, right? And I think probably a bit of a failing of my talk today, I didn't bring enough of those sort of concrete examples in, because to me that's what, you know, we can see evidence of that, you know, from around the world and what people have done to secure change. And I did this, I was involved in this amazing project with the Earth Charter quite a few years ago, which was called Pictures of Success, where we produced a range of cards, unfortunately no longer available, just photographs with some text of stories of change, right? And one of them was of a mud hut with a solar panel on the roof, right? And there was a sense in which things that were challenging sense of existing sense of fatality and despair were actually stories of change that are done by communities. And that again is where you address the question of dangers of individualistic responses to more collective responses. So to me, I think we have a responsibility in all of our work to bring in those sense of stories of success and change.
Sorry to interrupt, but now that I have my microphone working, Bridget, I was just going to let you know. I'm sorry I couldn't find it because of the sunshine.
That's okay.
Which I'm not complaining about. And I think my question really follows very neatly with your story, Doug, in terms of the stories of change and a mud hut with a solar panel, because I work with an NGO. We have a development education program we have had for many, many, many years. And so much of what you say, sort of is what you hope to do, but you're not in the fortunate position of being an educator who is with people for a long time. We tried to deepen the kind of engagement by repeat visits, we have categorized different topics. So we are guilty of climate change one week, gender equality the next, But my question to you, I think, is in that framework, the role and the responsibility and the access and the ease that we can join conversations with people from far-flung places, and technology being one of those ways. What is a good example, let's say a good positive story that you could even point me towards in relation to what an NGO can do and their role in the ever-changing complexity of the world, dealing with plenty of people who have really such positive stories but are facing really desperate circumstances. So just any comment you have on that, I'd really appreciate.
Yeah, opened up a big issue. I was involved for a number of years in a lot of project initiatives that are about encouraging partnerships between schools and community groups around the world, particularly from the global north and the global south. And I got engaged in that work because I was starting from a very critical perspective, right? And but what I found by listening to and engaging with groups, whether they were NGOs working with bringing groups of young people or educators together, the experiences, stories emerge if they were developed appropriately. Of actually, one interesting story or a project I was involved with that particularly looked at gender equality and the sense in which that process of learning about in partnership, the different ways in which gender was perceived in different cultures and communities, and how by providing access to girls to education, what impact that had upon them and the community. And those sort of they're stories, but they're stories that show by engaging with these issues directly that you actually can make a difference. But of course there are dangers of that and sense of paternalism and so on. But to me, it's about having that, providing those spaces for real world links and connections, right? And that unfortunately a lot of that stuff is, particularly under COVID, went that there wasn't that real, direct contact experience. And to me, there's lots of issues also in the era about international travel. But to me, the sense about how young people can meet and learn from each other, and they can then learn their stories and see about the context of their position in the wider world is, I think, important. So those to me are some of those things, and I think I wrote about that, and in my Development Education Research Centre, we have a series of research papers, and I think I've got 2 or 3 in that series that looked at some of those partnership stuff. So I think if you look at that, you'll be able to find them.
Doug, thank you so much. I'm going to draw our session to a close. I think we could probably stay here all afternoon talking and talking through some of the concepts we've come up with. Fortunately, I have a group of students waiting for me in another building that I have to run to. Doug, I just want to say an absolutely massive thank you for your contribution today, your incredibly thought-provoking talk, the generosity of doing so while ill as well. I really, really appreciate. And I think if you read through some of the comments of what we have, you can really see just how appreciative people are. I'm definitely going away with a huge amount to think about and to work through in my own mind about my own practice. So I really appreciate it. Just to let everyone know, I will the recording and the Doug's slides I will share afterwards with those of you once I have finished my lecture with students in a few minutes' time, so later this evening or tomorrow. And just to say, this talk was part of the LSRE series and supported by the National DICE project in Ireland. So once again, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Sorry that I'm going to run out now and not stick around, but hopefully those of you who are here will keep in touch as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.